The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening, everyone. This is Tim Cusick. I am the TrainingPeaks WKO4 product leader. We're here tonight to talk about coaching running with power using WKO4. We have a guest presenter tonight. Steve Palladino is, if you're in our Facebook group or you're following Running with Power, is probably one of the leading experts in the world on this topic, and I know has some great stuff. We're going to get him set up with the technology here. So let's just make sure. Steve, can you go ahead and show your screen? There you go.
There you go.
All right. Perfect. Now we can see your screen and everything looks great. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Tim. I appreciate the opportunity, and I'm hoping that everybody enjoys the topics that we're going to discuss tonight. Regarding questions, go ahead and type them in that entry box that you see on the upper right area. There's an entry box. Type them out. I'm going to probably defer most questions till the end, but if there's some good ones that are important to clarify some topics, we'll interrupt and just handle the questions right then and there. So that's just a little housekeeping. So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, you're probably wondering who the heck this guy is. That would be me. And just so you give you a little background, I have a 30-year career as a podiatrist, and my background is in sports medicine, foot and ankle surgery, and lower extremity biomechanics. So I carry a little background there. And then I also have a background as a runner back in the day, running a 2:16 marathon and 1980 Olympic trials marathon qualifier. Then, because of injuries and so forth, as I got into my 40s, I started cycling. And roughly around 2002, I got my first power meter. So I'm a 15-year user of power meters, and WKO4 came out about the same time. So I've been a user of WKO4 in one incarnation or another since about 2002, 2003. So got a lot of background in what's happened in the world of power, and in particular how WKO handles power. I had pretty good success as a cyclist, and then when Stride came out, it was like this epiphany for me. Hey, all of a sudden there's this power meter that allows me to do a lot of things with running that I've been doing with cycling on the coaching side. So when Stride came out, I was an early adopter. At least the athletes that I coach were early adopters, and I had a couple of them started in August of 2016. So I've been coaching with power since that point in time. So the bottom line is I know some stuff, but I don't know everything, and I'm always looking to learn new stuff. And the bottom line is that this is an emerging field. In a year from now, we're all going to know a lot more stuff. We'll follow that. But one thing to keep in mind as I go through this, my experience with running power is limited to Stride. There's other products coming on the market. They report power a little bit higher than Stride, so some of these metrics are not going to be the same reference points. Same metrics, but they'll have different reference points. So caveat for this webinar is that most of my numbers refer to Stride power. What I'm going to do in terms of the presentation, I'm going to cover how you set up a runner in WKO4 and set FTP for a runner, and then go over workflows for getting data into WKO4, cover a few metrics, particularly the primary metrics, and then go through what I do at the workout level and at the athlete level in terms of charts and analysis. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try to keep it simple and just distill this rather diverse and complex topic down into some basic coaching workflows and analysis. Not going to be able to get into detailed coaching philosophy or training prescription strategy, and I'm not going to go into everything that WKO4 can offer. I mean, it goes into a lot deeper than what I'm going to be able to present into analyzing an athlete's running. But certainly the charts are available, and you can build what you want. Depending on, if you can think about it, you can probably build it to analyze that particular aspect of a runner's data. So there are some things I'll get into, but I'm going to try to keep it simple as much as possible. All right, let's start with the athlete setup and the entry of set FTP. Right now in WKO4, there's some hurdles with regards to runners. Number one, for runners, if you drop a bunch of runner data, runner fit files in, you're not going to have a default area for setting FTP. The other thing is, if you're a multi-athlete, WKO4 only allows you to set one FTP value. So if you set a cycling FTP, you can't set a run FTP. So those are the hurdles. And I have to emphasize those are the current hurdles, because I know that the folks at WKO4 are working on those very elements, and you'll probably see some evolution in the not too distant future in those areas. So let's talk about what I do to get around these hurdles or get over these hurdles for a runner athlete. I might also direct you to Karen Mackin's webinar that she recently gave. She covers multi-athletes and might have some good resources there as well. I'm going to speak particularly specifically about the runner. So to set a runner up, an athlete up, most of you know this, but I'll go over it anyway. You'll come to the lower left-hand part of your screen there and click the plus sign. That's going to bring up an athlete entry area, athlete details, and what you do is just fill those in with the pertinent data required. I'm going to point out one thing is this thing called tags. If you are a coach and you have multiple athletes, you could tag the athlete, and that way you can then come to your upper left search box and sort athletes. So I have athletes by high school, by elite, by age group, and I'll soon have a couple sprinters, so I'll probably set up a tag for sprinters as well. So it's a nice way for a coach with multiple athletes to quickly get to a certain group of athletes by using that tag function. Another thing, as you're filling this data out, I want to talk specifically about keeping weight accurate and up to date. Weight is necessary for some of the metrics that we're going to use in our charts and reports. You know, watts per kilogram. Running effectiveness also uses weight in the watts per kilogram portion of the equation. Leg spring stiffness per kilogram are just a few to mention where weight is important. So you have to keep that up to date, and on top of that, you want to keep it in sync with stride weight. So I'm always bugging my athletes, what weight setting do you have in your stride app, because I want to keep it in line with what I have in WKO4, so I'm getting accurate data and analysis. So keep that weight entry accurate and up to date and in sync. But you'll notice here that I've already loaded fit files for running for this test athlete. That's in their file. It's in their database, but there's no area to enter FTP. There's no data box. And you also notice up at the top that it automatically defaults to 250 watt set FTP, and you'll see that there's no hero bar metrics. That is the case for runners. A runner athlete is not going to have a hero bar. It's not going to populate, but there's still ways of seeing those metrics, and I'll show you that later on in the webinar. So we want to be able to utilize and set FTP for a number of reasons. So let's go about how to do that. how to enter set FTP. Well, the first thing we have to do is we have to create a sham bike workout. A bike workout, by making it a bike workout, it's going to fool WKO4 into thinking that there's also some bike stuff in here. We could set an FTP. So we're going to double click on the test athlete to get into the workout level. And then once we're in workout level, again, see, I noted how I had already uploaded a bunch of fit files into, or downloaded a bunch of fit files into WKO4. Well, once we're in this workout level, to be able to set that FTP, we're going to come and set that sham workout, bike workout. So we'll click down here in the lower left to add a workout, and this is what will pop up. We're going to see a new workout. It will say planned for whatever the next day of the week is. Well, there's a few things I want to mention here. Go to workout details. Notice it says run. It just defaulted to run, and it defaulted as a future planned workout. We're going to change that around a little bit. So I just locked screen here, so let me see about, oh, there we go. Okay, so we're going to change a few things. Again, workout details for that sham workout. We're going to click on this box. It said run. We're going to switch it to bike. We're going to put a date in. I put the date that precedes all the other run data. So the earliest date where you started collecting data, I'll put that date in. I'll title it sham bike workout so I can identify it in the future. And I just put one training stress score point here just to activate that. Now, once I've done that, I can click back to the athlete level, and now you can see FTP appears as a data entry area. So this is what we want, and so you just click on that box, and just like the other areas of the data entry area in athlete details, we could now put the person's set FTP. You can see that once you do that, it populates up here. Still no hero bar metrics, but we'll get to that. But at least now we have a runner athlete, and we can set FTP and update FTP as a set FTP as we go. And that will allow us to use these other key metrics that depend on set FTP. I like using percentage of FTP, which is another way of saying intensity factors. I calculate it differently. I use power divided by set FTP as opposed to normalized power divided by set FTP. But still, you need that set FTP in either case. Power training zones. I have a dashboard of charts that have 4, 5, 6 different performance manager charts with different algorithms for calculating training stress, and a couple of them use power, and that would be the training stress score, the classic Coggan training stress score, and Stride's RSS also uses CP or set FTP in this environment. So you need set FTP for that, and then also if you're going to have training zones, or at least reference training zones, at least if you're using the ones that I've created, it's going to be based on percent of FTP, and FTP is the primary anchor point. So set FTP is an important thing to be able to do in WKO4. The other reason is, it's an aerobic sport, damn it. This is Andrew Coggan quote. And while I'm at it, as we go through this webinar, there are, Andy Coggan's got his fingerprints over a lot of things on this webinar. There's running effectiveness, there's the performance manager chart, there's the power duration curve. So we'll acknowledge him for that, but I also like his sayings, and this one's an important one, because if you look at races, runners are executing between 5K and marathon, it's FTP plus or minus 10%. So under that umbrella of FTP plus or minus 10%, most runners' races are executed. So it really is an aerobic sport given what FTP represents, and you're not drifting too far away on either side. So again, setting FTP and keeping track of it is an important aspect. So there you go. We've now set an athlete up. We've even gone to the process of allowing ourselves to set an FTP. Now let's talk about dropping data into that athlete's database. So the way I like to look at it is I use this chart here, and what I want to do is end up down here with WKO4. I want everything to drop into WKO4. That's where I'm going to do my analysis. I do everything in WKO4, well, almost everything. I've got a couple of Excel sheets, but I want everything in WKO4. So I've got to get it from the data source, which is the watch file or strides file via offline sync. I want to get from there down to here at WKO4. And this is the pathway a lot of data flows. It'll go from the source to whatever associated primary platform, whether it's Power Center, Garmin Connect, or what have you. And then that can get pushed to TrainingPeaks or Final Surge or a training analysis platform. And then finally, we get the data to WKO4. So that's the general pathways. Let me talk about how I get it in. There's a couple different ways, actually. So I have a large group of my athletes. What I have them do is I have them offline sync Stride, the pod, to their phone app into Power Center. And then I have them download their fit files from Power Center and email them to me once a week. So they end up to me via email, then I can then store them in a local file on my computer and then drag and drop into WKO4. The other thing I'll tell those athletes is I say, sync your watch to the Garmin Connect or Moves Count so you have a backup. Don't push between these two. In other words, I like to keep Power Center separate from Garmin Connect and Moves Count. So push the watch to Garmin Connect, push Stride to Power Center, and then you have two separate files. And if you need to analyze some glitches, you've got two files of the same run that you could compare in the future. So that's just a little tangent there. But the bottom line is one pathway is to go Stride, offline sync, Power Center to fit file to dropping fit files in WKO4. And I have a large group of athletes that do it that way. Another large group of athletes I have is the ones that are using on Final Surge, and I'm delivering the training programs on Final Surge. They're going to have typically Garmin Connect push to Final Surge. Hopefully in the near future, Power Center can be pushed to Final Surge. But the bottom line for me, on my side, all I have to do is go to their calendar on Final Surge and download fit files onto my local file computer and then drag and drop files into WKO4. So everything gets pushed to Final Surge. I collect it from Final Surge once a week, and it's actually quite efficient doing it that way. So what I was saying is I'll take fit files. I'm going to put it on a local file on my computer for each athlete. Then I simply highlight the ones I want to drag and drop, highlight them, drop them. This pops up, the pop-up screen on WKO4, and I click import to the correct athlete, of course, and there you go. We now have data in WKO4. Now, that's the two ways I usually do it. I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention that some athletes push their data to TrainingPeaks, and TrainingPeaks can actually have a direct sync to WKO4. I don't use that, so I'm not going to comment on it. And there's plenty of references, both written as well as, I believe, webinar format on how to achieve that sync of TrainingPeaks data into WKO4. All right, I want to go into key metrics, and here's an area where I really want to try to distill things, because people can go crazy with the number of different metrics that are out there and the number of different metrics they can create, and metrics that create metrics, etc. It gets crazy, and you don't need all of that stuff. So let me try to organize it and distill it down for you. So, in the end, what we do is we make this guy faster and not more confused. So I'm going to just start with this. I'll come back to this graphic in the future part of the webinar. But I wanted to point out that ultimately we're trying to improve performance. We're trying to improve speed. And there's only a few things that contribute to that performance. So how do we to improve? Well, in terms of power, not physiologic metrics, but in terms of power, there's 3 ways to improve performance. Number 1, we're going to increase power to weight that you can hold for a specific duration. So your power to weight at FTP, or your power to weight at 5 minutes, or power to weight at 15 minutes, what have you. You increase that power to weight and you're going to be going faster. Number 2 is to increase the duration that you can hold a specific power to weight. So this is a good analogy would be taking FTP and trying to lengthen out the time to exhaustion, try to develop that metric. So let's say your FTP is 4.5 watts per kilogram, and your time to exhaustion currently is 40 minutes. Well, we're going to do workouts and do some training to try to make it 4.5 watts per kilogram that you can now hold for up to maybe 60 minutes. So that's another way of improving is expanding fatigue resistance, or increasing the duration you can hold a specific power to weight. The last one is this one. You improve performance by improving the effectiveness with which you convert power to speed, essentially running effectiveness. This is another one of the metrics that Andy Coggan developed, and it's a very important one in my mind. So those are the 3 ways. Now, having said that, you get a lot more movement with developing those power to weight aspects, the power to weight for a specific duration, or expanding the duration for a given power to weight. Those things are easily more trainable than is running effectiveness. Doesn't diminish this, we still want to work on it, but just to point out that this is where most of the money is over on power to weight, and but still some gains to be had by improving this running effectiveness. So there's 3 ways to improve performance. So why not look at metrics that allow us to analyze those particular 3 things? So 2 key metrics in my mind are power and duration. Of course, power has a lot of different incarnations, whether it's raw power, or power to weight, or FTP, or intensity, relative intensity like percent FTP. But power and duration, those are 2 key metrics, and that's where I would say I would guesstimate that probably 80-90% of my focus is on those 2 metrics right there. Because of those 2 metrics, it enables this little baby right here, this beauty, which is the power duration curve model. And we'll come back to this. Just pointing out, this is how I have it set up, so I can look at both the measured and model. This is the actual maximal powers that a runner has performed, what the model predicts, and then I also convert it to watts per kilogram and percent of MFTP. But power and duration enables that. It also enables us to look at fatigue-resistant metrics, like some of these that I have listed here. Running stamina, which is basically a ratio of 2-hour power to 1-hour power. So in this athlete, their 2-hour power is 94% of their 1-hour power. So I'm looking at that as I'm developing fatigue resistance in some of my runners that are doing half marathons, marathons, and beyond. We also do the same thing with running effectiveness, because running effectiveness can deteriorate with fatigue and duration. So I'm looking at how does running effectiveness deteriorate with time on a 2-hour to 1-hour relationship. And endurance readiness, I'll cover this a little bit more, but this runner, is basically 132% in terms of endurance readiness for a full marathon. So we can look at power and duration from a number of different perspectives. It also enables, like I said earlier, enables us to track duration, power, relative intensity, which allows us to get training stress and some of these performance manager chart metrics. So key metrics. Power duration enables us to prescribe workouts in terms of duration and relative intensity, both in power and duration. Now, this one here that I'm pointing to at the bottom, 6 times 5 minutes at 100 to 102% of FTP. Why not distance? Well, because distance, a 5:30 FTP type pace runner is going to cover a mile differently than someone's running at an 8-minute pace. So the runner running 8-minute pace is going to be a lot longer duration. It's not the same dose. So by doing power and duration, we're really controlling the dose that we're prescribing our runners. On top of being able to prescribe it that way, we can look at power and make sure that it's carried out as we desired. And here's a runner that looks like, to me, I think it's 2 times 15 minutes with 3 minutes rest in between, something of that order, with some accelerations in the warm-up phase. I could also tell you this is on a treadmill. Just look at how fine those tracings are. That's treadmill data right there. Looking at power, we can look at trends. So here's a race. This is a half marathon race, and you can see this runner started off pretty good. Started off pretty good, but somewhere right around an hour and 8 minutes, power started tapering off a little bit. So a little fatigue resistance issue with this athlete's race. We could actually look at the slope and confirm that it is a downward trending power file. So again, power is a critical metric. With power to weight, we can even start comparing runners, one runner to another. Can't do it by raw power. We have to do it by watts per kilogram. So what this chart is actually a profile for FTP, where estimated, this is from the guys at The Secret of Running, where they estimated the world elite FTP is about 5.7 watts per kilogram on the female side, 6.4 watts per kilogram on the male side, and then it's just scaling an athlete relative to that. This is of a female athlete that she produced 4.7 watts per kilogram, and she just sort of dips into what would be approaching national class elite runner. We can also do it, scale it versus world records. Here's power to weight, the same athlete that I just showed you. Power to weight versus world record at 100 meters, 400, 800, I believe that's 1,500, 5,000, 10,000. She actually scales pretty well against 10,000. That was her primary event last year. So we can begin to compare runners using power. We can also, like I said earlier, we can track FTP. The power duration curve is pretty accurate. I use in one that I use, the chart that I use, I throw these little standard estimation of error and coefficient of variation metrics onto that chart, so I can sort of track how tight is my FTP estimate, and you can see it's pretty tight here for this runner. We can track these things over time, so it's not just a matter of establishing what they are, but we can track how they are over time. This is that runner, same runner, over time, looking at MFTP over time, and this is her PR 10,000 meter race, which bumped up her MFTP right there. You can do this. You can track 5-minute power. You can track 1-minute power, etc. But you can certainly do this, and this is already a pre-built chart where you can track MFTP over time. So there's a lot of things we can do. If you can set FTP, you can also set intensity around FTP and develop training zones, this is the training zones that I've worked out or elaborated, and you can even go so far as to transfer those onto a runner's power duration curve. This is thanks to William Renfro. He helped me, or actually he didn't help me. He did this chart. I gave him what I wanted, and he did this one on the bottom. So it basically zone 7 Pmax, zone 6 anaerobic, zone 5 is maximal aerobic, zone 4 is that transitional super threshold. This is zone 3B and 3A. So this allows you to go in, and on the way I have it set up is I can look at the power duration curve up above and see what kind of zone that tracks into for a runner as I get into planning stages and analysis. Furthermore, when you have that relative intensity and you've prescribed a workout, you can come back and check to see how runners execute the workout. So this is one where I had the runner do a continuous workout 4 times 1,000 with a 200-meter float with those power prescriptions, those power bands, and then finish with a 200-meter kick. So that's a 5,000-meter workout, and this is sort of a race tune-up workout. And you can see here's what I wrote, and I didn't give her a power prescription at 200 meters because I just wanted her to go, go all in. And we can see that she executed pretty well, 102, 101% across the board for the thousands, and then 119% on the end. And that's sort of the very top end of zone 6 or anaerobic phase, which that makes sense if she's kicking it in at 200 meters at the end. So power and duration enables most of our prescription and most of our analysis. Now, there's also that other part, running effectiveness. So let's talk a little bit about that. So I've already covered this a little bit, but running effectiveness is a ratio of speed to power. So it's speed in meters per second divided by power in watts per kilogram. And that is running effectiveness. That was a metric developed by Andy Coggan. And what I've found is that it's a pretty powerful metric, and you could also rearrange it, and it sort of explains how do we get runners faster. Speed is a product of how effectively we convert power to speed, or running effectiveness. It's a product of that and the power. So a very important metric, and we've already gone through this slide. So let's go a little bit into running effectiveness. It's sensitive to intensity. So at high intensity, short durations, running effectiveness is going to be higher. You can see this is, the blue line here is mean maximal running effectiveness, and we can see that it doesn't start to plateau and flatten out until you get purely into the aerobic range of 20 minutes and beyond. And even then, it's still you can still decrease running effectiveness with lower intensities. So keep in mind that when interpreting running effectiveness, it has to be controlled to intensity. Also, hills. Here's running effectiveness. Looking at how it behaves on a hill. This is a hill tempo that one of my runners was doing. You can see as soon as they hit this slope, running effectiveness drops down because they're producing the same power. I was asking them to do ISO power up this hill, but they're going slower. So because of the mathematics, running effectiveness is going to be lower in this scenario. And here's another steeper slope, running effectiveness drops down. A little downhill, and running effectiveness pops back up. So it's sensitive to hills. Also wind. You're running ISO power with variable wind. This is a guy who is running on a track on a rainy, windy day, and he was running. His effort was about the same regardless of where he was on the track, but you can see that whether he's going into the wind or with the wind, it changed his running effectiveness. So running effectiveness is sensitive to these environmental issues as well as intensity. So what we want to try to do is normalize it if we can. Let me give you an example. Karen Mackin worked on this, and also Andy Coggan came up with the elevation power concept of normalizing. Karen Mackin worked on this normalized graded pace version for developing a normalized running effectiveness. So we're normalizing it to hills. This is that same athlete that I showed you earlier on the hill tempo. And you can see red is the normal mathematics for computing running effectiveness. And you can see how it behaves as I described. But once we start normalizing it, we get a much smoother line and probably a better representation of the person's effective running effectiveness, or how effective they were indeed converting power to speed. So just an example of how we can try to normalize running effectiveness. Running effectiveness, like power and speed, we can also track that, and we can trend that. This is a race. It was a 10,000 meter race, that 10,000 meter PR, and her running effectiveness was pretty flat. So that's pretty good staying power as far as the mechanics. I've seen some runners where the running effectiveness is actually declining, meaning they're starting to break down. I've seen runners doing intervals where their power is flat, they're able to hold power, but their running effectiveness is declining. What does that tell you? That means they're holding power, but their form is starting to break down in their last couple of intervals. So it's a good way. Watching trends is another thing you can do with running effectiveness. I mentioned earlier normalized graded pace method of normalizing running effectiveness. This is National Club Cross Country Championships. This is a pretty bumpy course. I know that because I have this metric called course variability index. Basically, it's total feet of climbing divided by the distance of the race. So it's feet per mile, basically, in English units. And that's a pretty bumpy race. Under 20 is pretty flat. So if it's under 20, a course is under 20, I usually will refer to the primary running effectiveness. But this is one was pretty bumpy. So I'm saying, well, that's not her. She usually runs about 1.03 for most of her races, 1.03 or 1.04. And sure enough, when we normalize it for that hills based using that normalized graded pace, we get 1.03. So that sort of made me feel a lot better. And certainly her other numbers were pretty normal for her race. Other things we can do with running effectiveness, we can use it for race time prediction. This is an athlete who ran a half marathon recently, and leading up to the half marathon, I was doing some numbers. I sort of estimated the runner might be able to hold 280 watts for their half marathon. I slightly fudged up on race distance just so I didn't underestimate the time. And I knew their running effectiveness from their workouts and their training runs, what they typically run. And I plugged those numbers in, and with my Excel calculator, I predicted that he would probably be around 132. He ended up running 279 watts for his half marathon, ran 133.11, I believe, or 133.12, and that was a new PR. So it's pretty uncanny if you get things right, that it can be used as for race time prediction. The other thing it can be used for is race power requirement prediction. So if I want to run an 1850 5K, again I fudged up a little bit here, but if I want to run an 1850 5K, and one of my runners wants to run an 1850 5K, believe me, I could take the runner's weight, their running effectiveness, and insert that time, and again with my calculator I could predict that he's going to need about 328 watts to get that time. It's interesting because his last PR, I gave him a power target, and he overran that power target quite successfully and got a huge PR. But this is what he needs to do to get that if he runs at that running effectiveness. If he runs a little bit more effectively, then the power requirement is going to be lower. If it's less, if he runs at 1.00, this number I think is around 331 watts. I've already done the calculations for him. So running effectiveness is powerful in multiple ways. A lot of people will ask, well, what's good? Well, you can stratify potential based on running effectiveness. You can stratify people based on how effectively they convert power to speed. And what I found is 0.99 to 1.01 is about average, near average. Less than 0.99 needs some work. Above 1.01 is pretty good, and over 1.04 to 1.05, that's pretty elite. Like I said, that one emerging elite athlete I was just talking about is typically 1.03 to 1.04, which is pretty good. So you can stratify according to running effectiveness. Now, I mentioned earlier that gains in power, whether it's power for set duration or extending duration for set power, those are easier to come by than changing running effectiveness. But that's not to say you can't. So this is an athlete that you can sort of see. I mean, you can make out, it doesn't show up over here, but it does look like there's a slight, very slight upward slope of running effectiveness over time. The date is on the bottom. So you can improve it, and whether it's by improving horizontal power or leg spring stiffness or other factors like running economy, which we can't really measure by power, you can improve running effectiveness. It's just a long, slow process. All right. Now, one other curious and interesting thing as we look at this, I have no idea how fatigued he was on each one of these days. And we know that running effectiveness does change with fatigue. I've already talked about that. Here's a curious little slide. Same runner. On the bottom, on the x-axis, we have training stress per day. We have TSB, training stress balance. And to the right is fresher legs, to the left is more fatigued legs. And you can see it appears that for this runner, the fresher their legs, slightly better running effectiveness. So this is a little interesting thing that we need to keep in mind as we're interpreting stuff, and also in terms of race planning. Maybe we get a tiny little bump in running effectiveness as we taper for a big race. All right, so running effectiveness is a big one. What else? Well, you can see now we're drilling down. Horizontal power ratio and leg spring stiffness both, I think, kick into running effectiveness. There's other things, we're going to cover this later, but let's talk about those two ones in blue: horizontal power ratio and leg spring stiffness. So we've got 3 down. We're adding a 4th: horizontal power ratio. Horizontal power ratio is the ratio of horizontal power to gross external power, which is basically what Stride reports as your power. So horizontal power divided by power. How do you get horizontal power? Well, on flat terrain, if you take power and you subtract Stride's form power, or AKA oscillatory power, and then divide it by power, you're going to get horizontal power ratio. Now, let me try to explain how that is important. If someone has a higher form power ratio and lower horizontal power ratio, their vector of external power is not quite as effective. As we lower form power ratio or increase horizontal power ratio, they're reciprocal. So I like to focus on this because this is improving their speed. Their vector is going to be far better for directing what power they're creating, their gross external power. More of it is going to be directed horizontally. There's an article that goes over conceptualizing this, and all you need to do is look at Mo Farah here and look at his stride, and I'm willing to bet that this is a guy that's over 80% in terms of horizontal power ratio when he's at FTP. You can just see that. So the more power that you are directing horizontally, the more speed you're going to generate. And the more effectively you are at converting power to speed. How do I know that? Well, you can look at up here we have horizontal power ratio in blue versus speed on the x-axis. So y-axis, horizontal power ratio, speed on the x-axis. Faster you go, the greater horizontal power ratio. Here, down in the second graph, we have running effectiveness on the x-axis. We have on the right axis, on the y-axis, we have horizontal power ratio. In this runner, the higher their running horizontal power ratio, the higher the running effectiveness, or vice versa, whichever way you want to look at it. They tend to have a correlation in this runner. When I originally presented some of these markers for horizontal power ratio, I gave these reference points. These are based on athletes that I've seen in multiple different workouts. But when you look at horizontal power ratio at functional threshold power, at that intensity on relatively flat terrain, so we're just sort of standardizing how we're interpreting horizontal power ratio. These are how people stratify. 75 to 77% is about where most people fit in. Under 75% needs work. More than 77% is good, and like I sort of suggest with Mo Farah there, more than 80% is probably the realm of elite world-class runners. You can't get to 100%. That's called rolling down the hill, basically. You have to have some oscillatory power. But in essence, the bigger your horizontal power, the more effective you are at converting external power to horizontal direction movement. Leg spring stiffness. Leg spring stiffness is, think of it this way, it's the elastic energy stored in your soft tissues. As you are landing, you are storing elastic energy in your ligaments, in your fascia, in your Achilles tendon, in your other tendons. When you are propelling, there's elastic recoil, and that delivers some energy back into propulsion. And it doesn't cost any oxygen. Meaning you're loading those elastic elements and they're unloading, delivering back some energy back into your stride. So to me, the higher your leg spring stiffness, the greater your running effectiveness. You're going to get free energy into your stride without oxygen cost. And the science has shown that that higher leg spring stiffness does correlate with higher running economy. A whole different animal, but it does correlate with running economy. So here's a couple graphics sort of explaining what I would like to show in terms of leg spring stiffness. I'm going to go back one step to say one more thing. Raw leg spring stiffness is not a good metric because the bigger you are, the bigger the number. It scales to weight. So if you scale it to weight or normalize it by weight, then you can compare leg spring stiffness across athletes a little bit more effectively. So here's a runner where, again, speed is on the x-axis, leg spring stiffness on the y-axis. You can see that the faster they go, the higher the leg spring stiffness. So there's a correlation there. And down here, we have running effectiveness on the x-axis, and we have leg spring stiffness on the y-axis. You can see also there's a little bit of a correlation with leg spring stiffness and running effectiveness. So not in every athlete, but in this particular athlete, you can see that. If you want to know where you stand, these are the numbers to look at. So averages is around 0.143, and you can read the slide as well as I can. I like to see athletes above 0.150, and these numbers are pretty reliable from a pretty good database. So there you go. As I was talking about running effectiveness over time and how you can see it improve over time, you can do that see that with HPR as well as leg spring stiffness. HPR here is in the blue, and the leg spring stiffness is in the green. And you can see they both are trending upwards in this athlete. This is the same athlete that I showed earlier with running effectiveness trending upward over time. This athlete is improving HPR and leg spring stiffness as well over time. And when we look at it relative to training stress balance, again, relative freshness to the right on the x-axis, relative fatigue to the left side of the x-axis, you can see that there's some the correlation with how fresh the legs are in terms of these metrics as well. So curious and interesting. Like I said earlier, we're learning, and we're going to learn a lot more over the years to come. But nevertheless, these metrics are key metrics in my mind, key to follow. Again, I'm going to go back. Running effectiveness, power, duration, leg spring stiffness, horizontal power ratio. Basically, we've got our 5 metrics that I think are really critical to watch. Now, there's secondary metrics. There's metrics that aren't as important to me, but you need them to sort of interpret other values: speed, pace, distance. I've already talked about prescribing by duration as opposed to distance, so you get the appropriate training dose. Yeah, you want to know this and you want to look at it, but it's not something I dwell on. I dwell on those others far more. Same thing, you want to know things about how hilly the course is, temperature, absolute elevation in terms of altitude, and so forth. There's all these things that we can use to interpret, but they're secondary to those 5 that I mentioned earlier. And then there's some that I use. They're secondary metrics. I don't look at them in all cases, but when I'm drilling down and trying to discover a little bit more about a runner's horizontal power ratio or their running effectiveness, etc., I'll look at some of these others like cadence and vertical oscillation, ground contact time. But again, you can just go on and on with all these secondary metrics, and even further, you can go into some of these other ones I don't even bother with, like raw form power. I don't usually look at that. Form power ratio is a reciprocal of horizontal power ratio, so why bother in my mind? A horizontal power ratio is about going faster, and to me, that's the one to look at. I've already talked about raw leg spring stiffness. I don't bother looking at that. Normalized power is one I don't look at too often. More often than not, I see normalized power slightly lower than average power on most running files. The exception, normalized power can be useful on really variable runs like intervals or some of the extreme trail running, where normalized power may be a useful metric in those cases. I prefer percentage of FDP over intensity factor. It's tracking the same thing, but intensity factor uses NP, and as I said, most runner files, NP is slightly lower than percentage of than average power. Efficiency index uses power as a denominator instead of watts per kilogram, so you can't compare it across runners. E-core is the reciprocal of running effectiveness. So why bother looking at it? You already have a metric that tells you what's going on there. And then heart rate, yeah, not me. I don't bother looking at heart rate. Heart rate is pretty redundant if you're following power. Not to say there is no use, but it's relegated to a distant secondary metric in my mind. So again, if we want to keep it simple, and I do, we want to keep our key metrics down to these 5. All right, let's talk a little bit about the analytic process. And basically what I do is I'll load new data. I'll look quickly to see if there's any FTP change, and then update the set FTP, go on to workout level analytics, come back to the athlete level analytics, and then plan future training. So my number 1 analytic at the workout level is this run summary pack. I'll share that with everybody. I've updated some things in it. It has all of these different child charts and a parent chart that is a tracing of the run with pace and elevation. I usually refer to that and the run summary down here at the workout level. You can, using this chart, you can clip out selected ranges, like this is a hill tempo, and then I could go down here and analyze that, or I can clip out this portion, which is 8 times 30-second intervals with 130 rest, and then scroll down and analyze those particular elements. And I'll just use the scroll bar here and scroll right down through all those important metrics that I talked about. In this pack, I'm generally referring to that parent chart, using the run summary, and then workout details. I'll enter what the workout was and some of the other information, notes, and so forth. keep in mind, and when I release these packs, the updated packs, Garmin Connect and Stride Direct Power Center syncs, offline syncs, is going to generate metrics just slightly differently, particularly cadence. So it changes some of these metrics. So it's important to have the right chart. So you're not seeing 398 as a cadence instead of 100, 180 something. For intervals, I'll delve down a little bit. I'll use that run summary pack, but then I'll delve down and look at it, look at a few other things. Here's a workout where the athlete did 4 times 6 minutes at just juxta threshold here, and then after recovery did 4 times 400 with 2-minute recoveries. You can sort of see that, and I can analyze each one of those elements as you see here and check to see what they're executing the tempo portions, those 4 times 6 minutes. So that's about at target. I can evaluate those other metrics as I scroll down. But I also use these charts. This is a chart that originally was developed by Andy Coggan, but I've changed it dramatically. But I'll take a quick look at it. I'm not going to say this is absolutely accurate in terms of VO2 kinetics, but it gives me an idea if my workout is getting close to the mark. And here we can see that during these tempo sections, they're approaching VO2 max for this particular athlete, which I think is a little bit overestimated for those. But again, it's not. I wouldn't sell this as a perfectly accurate chart, but it gives you sort of a feel for what's going on. And similar with this one, this was looking at how FRC is depleted in those 4 times 400, which are anaerobic FRC depleters, and you can see that the workout is actually apparently doing what I designed it to, is to tap into the FRC. This chart is not accurate. It's not true to perfect accuracy, because you can't go negative in FRC. You can go to 0, but you can't go negative. But it does give you a feel for what your workout's doing. In races, I will use that run summary pack, but there's a few other secondary things like the fatigue indicator pack. In the fatigue indicator pack, there's some of these index reports where it gives you like half index. It compares the second half to the first half. You can see this runner, the second half, they actually improved running effectiveness by 0.3%, and so on. We can evaluate metrics that way. We can look at quartiles for a given race and see how, in this case, power looks from quarter to quarter to quarter in a race. We can look at the speed and running effectiveness correlation dashboard to see how things are correlating. I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time, but I will point out one thing. In this athlete, as speed increases, you can there's a green leg spring stiffness. They increase leg spring stiffness slightly. This athlete, it actually declines. So people have signatures on what happens with form power and leg spring stiffness. They have there's some signatures there, and I think what we'll learn over time is they will be directing us on how to direct training. Races. Like I said, we have these 3. I'll look at those various secondary packs, and again, I will release all of those packs. They're already there on Palladino Power Project, but I've updated some, so I'll update them on the file section of Palladino Power Project. And I'm sure Debbie will also get them out as well. So now I'll go back to the athlete, and I want to look at 2 things. I want to look at what's happening training load, what's happening with the duration-based metrics. So training load pack is a big one for me. Again, a lot of child charts. I'm not going to belabor each one, but I'm going to go to the performance manager chart, which works very well in runners. Evaluate that. I like to look at the ramp rate in my runners, ramp rate of their training. You can see this runner here had a race on December 3rd. So we were ramping, taper, drop in the race, PR, and then now we're back on another ramp here, which you can see down below. So I'll look at that. You can look at more, traditional reports where you're looking at distance, but you can look at total work done, training stress, et cetera, week by week, and even their best here. That's in there. This is one that I like to look at in terms of the distribution of their training volume as I'm looking at training load. So this athlete here had about 79% is down here in zone 1 and 2, and the rest is up here in these various zones above zone 2. This is the time in zones based on the power zones that I've put out. After looking at training load, I'll look into the duration-based metrics pack, which is going to give me an idea of what's happening, what has happened, and where we're going to go. It's like a roadmap to me. So there's various child charts. As I said, I'm not going to belabor each one, but I have this one here where we actually look at the curve from 20 minutes out, an NP curve, to see if it's any different from the standard power duration curve. I look at a submaximal fatigue resistance. So I'm looking at fatigue resistance to the right of your power duration curve. And I look to see at, what percentage of power are they holding at 2 hours versus 1 hour and versus FTP. Same thing we can do with running effectiveness. We can also look at, have they run training runs that meet the kilojoule requirements they're going to need in a marathon. So people go, well, how far should I run? What should be my longest run when I'm training for a marathon? Well, this is what you're going to need for a full marathon. And this is your maximum that you've done in a training run down here. This is the percentage of what you've done versus what's needed. When I see this percentage down around 70%, yeah, that person needs a little bit more, a little bit longer training on their long runs. I like this one here. This is a 90-day look back a week ago and a 90-day look back today. That one gives me a quick glance, since I'm doing training programs once a week, to see what's happened in the last week. And this runner, they ran a half marathon, and essentially they didn't bump up their threshold, but they pushed out their time to exhaustion. So their time to exhaustion all of a sudden is reading an hour and 7 versus 49 before the half marathon. I've already showed this one, and it allows you to look at power duration curve. We can see, oh, there's a little dip of their maximals at 13 seconds versus the model, and we see where that lies in terms of the various zones here. Another interesting one is the run FTP contribution with time to exhaustion. This is a runner's approximate 5K. We can see at their 5K, it's for this runner, 97% of its aerobic performance and 3% is contributed by anaerobic sources. So it's a pretty good idea of getting a feel for what part of the power duration curve you're dealing with and what kind of training you're going to prescribe. Leading to this interval targeting, where the lines here, this is 97, 95% of your target right here. So I'm looking at this dip, and I'm going, if I want to train up that dip, I'm going to train probably around 95% of that target, which for this runner is going to be right around 400 watts. So maybe minute to minute 15 second, maybe quarter mile. If they want to do it on a track at roughly 400, might be a starting power, and see what they can handle with that. I can't go into too much detail in terms of prescribing, but charts are there for helping you out with that. So what I want to do is just finish up with just a quick little case. This is that runner that I spoke of. She's an emerging elite athlete. This is her build up to a 34:51 10,000 meter time. Basically what we see is a ramp early on in the early part of 2017. Really negative TSB because I didn't pre-seed her CTL, so it shows up really negative, but we can see a ramp here. Chronic intensity load is the dotted blue line. So what we see is we ramp up, then we start track, actually some track season. So we're racing intermittently, where I let her up to breathe a little bit at a couple points. So we're not really adding CTL too much. We're keeping intensity up. And then her primary event was right about here. So you can see a taper off of this CTL peak while keeping her intensity up. So she did really well, and then she got an invite into a bigger elite meet. So okay, we got to get back to training. We sort of let off this accelerator, and you can see that here in the ramp rate. We got to get back to training, so we ramp back up, as you see down here, through the month of May. Leading into a June 10th. You can see where we let her back, tapered her off, let her back up, her TSB came positive, and then she hit her race here and had a nice PR. During the month of May, this little training block here leading to her PR, here's her training distributed by zones. She did 68% in zone 1 and 2, and then you can see most of that percentage is, what's that, 22, 29, 32, 33% of her training was up in these zones from 3A and higher, getting ready for this 10K. The race itself, you can see it's pretty nice, looks pretty nice. She set a power PR on top of her time PR. She ran at about 103% of FTP. Her running effectiveness was her predictable 1.03. Really nice horizontal power ratio, close to 80%. And again, this is close to her FTP. And then leg spring stiffness, it was a little shy. She improved that towards the end of the year and got her consistently over 0.150. When I looked at it in terms of what happened during the race, in terms of that half index report, her running effectiveness did drop a little bit. Her speed dropped a little bit more than power, mainly because her horizontal power ratio dropped down. Her leg spring dropped down a little bit. So, she tapered off a little bit, but still, you look at this is a pretty nice race. So that gives you a pretty nice little synopsis of using these various things. Like I said at the outset, there is much, much more that you could dig into. There's many, many more charts that I have available, but hopefully that gave you a good idea of coaching with power for running. So are there any questions?
Hey, Steve, first and foremost, great job. Yeah. Thank you so much for doing it and giving such excellent detail and insight. I think you made some amazing points and overviews there. I appreciate you taking the time also in the beginning to show people how to set up WKO4 for running. I will tell the audience when we originally designed WKO4, running with power really wasn't out there. It kind of became a thing a couple of months after release. So we don't have the most streamlined onboarding for running with power. But as Steve mentioned, it's absolutely in the works and something that we expect to see some updates on. You know, I always hate to give a time, but probably sometime this summer. Moving on from that, Steve, there are a couple of questions. I've been answering most of them by typing in solutions, but there was a couple that were specifically related to what you were presenting, so I left them. I could either, if you can open them and read them, or I could read them to you, whichever works most comfortably for you.
I think since you're already on them, if you could just read them, it'll
Sure.
go a little faster.
Okay, question 1 went back to when you're talking about the importance of weight. Is it best to use naked weight or clothed weight?
I don't think that makes a difference. That clothed weight is fine to me, as long as it's done consistently over time. As long as it's done the same way over time, that's the important thing, is consistency.
Okay, number 2. Should we use the Stride CP as our FTP?
It depends on which method you use. I think if you use the 3 and 9 minute CP test protocol, it comes in pretty good. It might be a little bit high relative to FTP. CP can run high relative to FTP. If you enter your 5K time, which a lot of people do, I will tell you that probably will overestimate because they have to assume a certain running effectiveness and doing those calculations, and you're going to probably get an estimate that's a little bit too high.
Excellent. I would fully agree with that, by the way, just throwing my own 2 cents. In a marathon, another question. In a marathon, the weight of a runner will vary at different, will vary. I'm sorry, I can see that English language is not their native. So here, let me.
I know where it's going, though.
Yeah, the weight will vary after 2 hours. What about the chart and data calculations?
I think my answer to that is you're going to have to live with it. I do not try to micro tune things and assume things that you never measured. So I think you just go with what your starting weight is, what your stride weight is. Yes, there is some differences, but frankly, they're not big, impactful differences in the majority of cases. And one other thing, Tim, I'm going to go back one step to the CP thing. I will occasionally use a CP test, 3-minute, 10-minute CP test, and there's been times when I've done that because there's not been enough maximals to get a good MFTP out of the model. And once I do the test and drop those 2 values in, it's uncanny. The MFTP then comes pretty close to the CP once that data is dropped into the model. So the model works really, really well if you're hitting it with good maximals.
Yeah, excellent insight. Well said. Okay, what ramp rate range do you think is reasonable for most runners?
Well, you like to be. I like to be over 1 and under 7. I'd start worrying about runners getting over 7 in terms of ramp rate. I would say the ideal is 2 to 3 for most runners. It depends. It depends on your where you are relative to your maximum CTL. It depends on your training age, your injury history. There's a lot of depends in there, but 2 to 3 usually goes pretty well.
Excellent. Have you seen any difference in wattage of the same runner when they change shoe brands?
No, no. Um, if you're seeing that, that can be a problem with placement of the stride foot pod. What you're more likely to see is maybe a change in leg spring stiffness, even horizontal power ratio if it changes your mechanics, running effectiveness. You might see little changes like that, but you shouldn't really see a change in power unless there's an issue with pod placement.
Got it. What specific test do you like to set FTP?
That's a good question. I like the model. I rely heavily on the WKO4 power duration model. So if you're using that model, you're not confined to testing at only one duration.
Great
You
answer.
might test, you might test at 1 minute and 10 minutes one time. You might test at, 4 weeks later, you might test 3 minutes or that 1 minute and 15-second dip that you see on your power duration curve. So that's my primary. But then if I had a runner where for training reasons we're not going down, we're not going to cover the full spectrum of the power duration curve, and they're training for a marathon, we're sort of hugging that right hand side of the power duration curve, I might do a CP test, and 3 minute, 10-minute test is what I use. That said, I like using a 5K or 10K, and I've got methodologies to arrive at FTP from those races myself, and I'd rather do that than a CP test because the juices are flowing. You're going to get a truer maximum in a 5K or 10K race, and then I could do the math. So if I had to put in order, WKO4 model, 5K or 10K race, and then convert. And then third one would be CP model using 3 minute and 10 minute.
Excellent. All right, last question for the evening. What about power data when the runner has any kind of an injury?
I'm not sure what the question is now. If the question may be going, if the runner has injury and they miss some time, then what do? Do you have to rearrange the go with the new FTP, etc.? You think that's what the question is?
Yeah, it definitely is looking like some form of, and Felipe, if you want to add more, feel free to. My guess, just reading it, is what if they have some kind of an injury or a slight injury, do you see drops off in power? How might you? I almost think the question is diagnostic. Like, might you see that small injury in the power? Yeah, exactly. He just says you probably won't run like always. So yeah, would you see it in the power if somebody's beginning to, let's say they're picking up some shin splints or something like that? Do you start to see that as it's happening?
I have to be honest. I'm going to chalk that into the stuff that we're going to learn in the next year. We're evolving, and I only really have a couple runners that have had a couple dings over the last year and a half. So I haven't really delved too much into trying to come up with a distinct relationship. But believe me, if it's there, we're going to find it over the next 12 months to 24 months.
Yeah, it's funny. I just did a big podcast about models, and somebody asked me, what do I see the future, the next couple of years of modeling? Really, what are the key outputs? And, pre-prediction of injury, I really think is something that would be, the math is there. The models are sort of there. We might not need to know what to do, or how to make that connection yet, but I think it's definitely something that on the horizon. You're seeing it in professional team sports and things like that now more and more. And I think that is going to be
Yeah.
one of the fields where we're going to see data teach us some pretty interesting things in the future.
I agree 100%. We'll probably see some models that'll evolve in those directions.
Excellent. All right, Steve, thank you so much. Everybody, this should take us about 48 hours to get this recording saved and posted up on YouTube. Steve will share the charts via the Palladino Project Facebook site. He will also can put them in the WKO4 library, in which case you can look them up there. We hopefully can have them up by the time the webinar goes live.
Right. And if I could just interject, I'm not going to share stuff to WKO4 until I've made sure all those Garmin versus Stride glitches are out, and when they're ready for prime time, I'll release them, and hopefully that'll be very, very soon.
Okay, excellent. All right, everybody. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night. Bye now.